Existence. A World Made New. Written by Jared Neely. The Midnight Horror Junkies. Published August 4, 2016. Synopsis. Sometimes reality is more hurtful than anything else known to man. Sometimes it's impossible to separate fiction from fact. Tommy Felper, a devoted husband, found that out quick when he awoke to find out his diminished marriage to Bessie Anderson was nothing more than a faded memory. His fantasies were innocent up until then. Quote, "Life is a classroom in which each of us is being tested, tried, and passed." Robert Iboya. Chapter 1. Dead of Summer. The year was 1970, August 19th. When life in Marietta, Florida became much more incapable than he ever imagined it would. It was just that, afternoon like any other ordinary Sunday. The sunlight glinting against the maple-stained wood reflected against him. Entombed forever. It wasn't just an ordinary box, nor was it just a fancy casket. It was something much more dreading. It was a burning flag, a broken sail swaying in the open wind, a surrenderance of human life. "I guess I'll see you on the other side," he thought quietly to himself. "It can't be too much longer anyways, what's there to live for now?" He wondered to himself, peering towards her broken-heartedly. His tears were dry and his face was warm under the humidity. He stood alone. All of the others had already abandoned him the same way Bessie had. "I won't blame you for this, the funny thing is I actually blame myself for this," he continued to contemplate to himself. His mind began to unfold at the thought of her and how she unexpectedly died. How she appeared so alive yet so distant, laying there just a day earlier at the viewing. The way her neck was hidden, clothed over and hiding everything. An amateur makeup artist in town had fought tirelessly in an effort to conceal her tragic hanging. Although everyone knew the truth behind the whole masquerade. Seeing her lying there lifeless like that, her skin tone appearing more rubescent than he ever remembered when looking back at it. Her complexion peaches and cream, he had never seen her fixed up in that way while still alive. She wasn't exactly the cover girl cosmopolitan type, but more like the girl next door. She had what others would tag as natural beauty. On date night, which was typically on Fridays, she would use light purple lavender eyeliner and black mascara, but nothing much like what the cosmetologist had done to her. On the other hand, her work truly was cut out for her. It was a suicide so pointless nobody in town nor her family could comprehend why she had done it. Leaving her 3 children, Teddy Jr. 11, Brigitte 14 and Daniel 15, grieving and fostered in the care of social workers. Teddy was the runt of the pack, nicknamed after his father Gyp Malone Anderson, who ran off and haven't been seen ever since. Bessie believed he packed up and left state after learning of her complicated pregnancy. Gyp's youthful years were spent as a thriving prize fighter. A fight near the end of his boxing career had gone bad when the tank plucked out his right eye. The audience sat on their hands that unforgettable evening, witnessing a fight that should have been decided after the 3rd round. The fight should have been called but hadn't due to the referee placing a bet line on the tank Harry Heisman, an underweight that somehow pushed his way to the heavyweights. Some believed his fights to be thrown, but after that night they realized the hype had gotten it wrong. They labeled Gyp Malone Teddy the Tiger, chanting it after the tank collapsed along the ropes. The name stuck with him due to his ferocious left jab that had nearly killed the once unstoppable underdog. The other 2 siblings left behind were already teenagers, but the tragedy of their biological mother's untimely passing had damaged them in ways that were unimaginable. 14-year-old high school honor student Brigitte Anderson began inflicting self-mutilation on herself the night she arrived home from cheerleading practice. After accepting her mother's thoughtless death, she began cutting her legs in an attempt at rationalizing, but that was impossible due to the circumstances. The lacerations were just a way for her to release a torment she would forever question. The shock of her suicide was groundbreaking for the Andersons and for her entire extended family. The state of Florida had appointed counseling sessions that Wednesday for her daughter and 2 living sons who had outlived her. Which came much too soon and appeared rushed, understanding the gravity of it. There had been no will of testament left behind. There was no logical explanation for how she was feeling at the time and no indication of why she had taken her life. Only the unanswered questions and neighboring gossip that would soon follow, would remain. That despicable choice she had made left all of the others parting for their cars not far from him. He could sense the growing urgency just before they walked away. He watched them retreating not far from her. "That was you, Bessie. Nobody else did this except for you. You hurt a lot of good people with your fucking selfishness, and less. I blame myself for it as always. What have I done to you to deserve this? I'd truly like to know if I'm at fault. Could I have prevented this from happening?" he uttered, questioning his sanity as he glared towards the stained enclosure a foot away. He shook his head in frustration. "God damn it, Bessie, why did you do this to us?" He repeated the thought of her name in his mind while staring at the woodwork. Her casket glimmering against the summer sunset. Trees leaned against it, shading one half of him as he crept closer to her. Terrible thoughts ran strongly through him as he placed his shaky hands atop the wooden lid. His fingers dug into it, revealing his pain. The sound of uncut fingernails scrapped against her underneath. "Fuck it, you stupid bitch, I should have taken off when I seen this coming," he cried aloud. Immediately, pounding his hands against the solid maple. The hollow noise inside reminded him of his demoralized soul that very moment. He was crushed beyond extinction and carrying the life and death of his truest love against his battered sleeves. His eyes were aching from rubbing against them as he fought to stay awake. He hadn't slept in days since everything surrounding him disintegrated. He hadn't eaten much more than a few slivers of the week-old ham loaf and over-salted string beans his close friend Margaret Lansing had delivered sympathetically. The moment he came to the door she knew it. She knew he was out and out the second his face peered through the chain holding the door half open. She sensed it but ignored the thought of him doing so. If he was ready to end it the same way Bessie had, just maybe it was his time. Maybe it was supposed to be this way. She explored the idea of it, overwhelmed with total compassion, perceiving him through the underlit doorway. She watched his hideous face as she handed him the expertly plastic-wrapped plate. She could not summon the words he needed as she mustered the only ones she had. "I'm sorry for your loss, Tommy. If you ever need anything, I'm always a phone call away," she said, concerned for him. He stood a moment paralyzed at the thought of dialing her, but what she had said was the same thing everyone else had said or had said at one point in their lives. Those very words of encouragement no longer validated anything, they were just bland now and impersonable. Although, it was better than pity. The last thing he wanted was people stopping over telling him what he wanted to hear. 38-year-old Tommy Felper stood beside the only love he knew and learned, crying inside, holding on to it as if it would kill him to let it out. He knelt along the dirt where the grass had died. A mound of stone laid across from him where the dirt had been moved. Not far from it was a yellow and black Kubota. The gravedigger was parked alongside a row of unmarked headstones. The uncontrollable emotions encased him underneath the trees blowing subtly in the near distance. "I'm out of here, damn it, you won't have to see my sorrowful face again, never again." He then paused, listening to the others pull off in their precious cars. "Do you hear me, you ignorant woman?" he shouted, biting hard against his bottom teeth. He pushed down forcefully until the incisors began to grind against his back molars. "Sayonara, you're nothing now, you did this, I fucking tried to give you happy life," he shouted, sobbing at the base of the casket. The smell of freshly cut grass covered the area beyond him as he cried. Above him the clouds were hazy but the heat of the August sunlight unleashed into the old cemetery. Silver Cliff Cemetery was an old, unmanaged place with broken headstones and uneven ground. Teenagers often trespassed there by jumping over the iron fence. He leaned against the wood where she lay to rest. Wearing the dress he had bought her. The white polka-dotted gown she had once fancied. The thought of that day flashed upon him as he shut his eyes. He made sure to purchase it the next afternoon as a surprise for her. It was only their third date and things moved quickly for them back then. No more than a few months afterwards and they were already planning to be engaged. There wasn't even a sign of hesitation. Backing out of it had not crossed their minds, not once. It was as if things were to happen that way. It was the only real thing either had felt or had. They were partners, lovers and soulmates. "Tommy, I never want to lose you. Nobody ever made me smile the way you do." Her voice suddenly reverberated into his mind as he thought back. "You're the fire in my soul, Tommy. With you I'm something, without you it'd be nothing." Her voice played over in his mind. 5 years later and she would be gone for good. Somehow it didn't seem realistic. It seemed like something out of a drama, a terribly scripted screenplay or something insane as that. He cradled his hands against his face, holding his eyes closed with his fingers. He continued trembling at the thought of losing her. "Hey buddy. We're dropping her in now," came an unforeseen voice not far from him. A lanky man in filthy blue overalls approached him holding a lit cigarette in one hand. His silver and black beard dangling inches past his chin as he stared at him nearing. My. I'm sorry Mr. I didn't mean to drive you away I'm in no rush, really. If you have any last respects I'll leave you at it," he then said, noticing Tommy's startled reaction. The man's accent was southern and carried a tone not like many he had heard in Marietta. "Not at all. I said my piece. I might stick around for a short while but go ahead and do your thing. Cover her up," he responded, pulling himself onto his feet. He backed away from the nightmare. A nightmare it was. Melting his heart the way it had, he began to walk away into the graves on the far side of her. It wasn't long after, the gravedigger had clocked out and was nowhere in sight. The digging machine was moved and out of mind as Tommy circled the graves leading back towards Bessie's. She was now covered over where the dirt stunk of wet rain that had fallen a night prior. His hands were lowered into his pants pockets gripping the tiny keychain she had given him. He could feel the T-shaped emblem with two golden foxes facing one another. As he clenched his hand around it, it was just another hurtful reminder. Shaking his head in disbelief, he fought himself to not cry. "Not now," he thought quietly. Finally releasing his hands, he began to pull his jacket over himself in the dark. He zipped it up, still peering at the rank dirt poured over her. Tommy Felper bottled his anger inside as the night lifted over top of him. Something inside of him had finally turned off the screaming alarm in his head. His thoughts were clearer sitting against the rotten earth surrounding the plot of dirt, with her casket 6 feet underneath the impacted soil. Chapter 2 Thoughts. An hour later he found himself standing outside along the east side of Marietta. His sneakers were covered in marsh as he watched the building across the way, standing along the blotted sidewalk. Just a few yards from the pharmacy, the bright luminescent lettering flared Marietta Pharmaceuticals brilliantly over top of him as he peered in through the glass. A single customer remained inside, who at the moment was being serviced at the cash register. He studied the large bottle as the merchant dropped it into a cheap brown paper bag. His face was reddened, sunburned and coarse. Stubbles of hair covered his brawny face. He wore a red Boston Red Sox baseball cap and a black overcoat as he stood admiring the sign lit brightly above. He felt anxious as he peered in at the two. The merchant and the customer were having a deep conversation. He was unable to hear them from outside but could sense their amusement. The man in his mid-30s smiled and began to snicker as he gripped the bag, giving the man at the drawer a slight wave on his way out. The door chimed as it shut behind him, and not long after the man was gone. The night sky was heavy and dark, where he waited along the concrete pathway. Just a foot from him a black Lincoln passed by, suddenly blowing a blanket of leaves across the sidewalk. He peered at the car as it vanished out into the dark. Only him and the lights behind him remained, along with the worker inside who was now moments from closing up. Within moments the sign hanging on the other side of the glass would read "Sorry for the inconvenience, we're closed," and he wasn't about to let that happen. Not before going in. He glanced at his black dialed Seamaster wristwatch, staring at it and the time. It was minutes until midnight. His chest began to flutter as he approached the pharmacy in the near distance. Clutching the handle he pulled it open and entered inside, immediately ignoring the man sweeping around the foot of the entranceway. 3 minutes until closing time, sir, the clerk murmured, continuing to brush the pile into the trash bin. He said nothing as he hurried for the sleep aid on the far right side of the store, where a miscellaneous of over-the-counter drugs sit on shelving. I never thought I'd be saying this, but Florida sure feels closer to home than Tucson, Arizona, the clerk said suddenly, meeting him at the shelf where the glinting bottles of sleep aid reflected from the lights hanging overhead. He continued to sweep the floor, peering at him up and down. He held the broad end of the aged broomstick glaring at him in front of the stockpile of pills. Sleep aid was his only choice of a restful night. He hadn't taken any since high school. He was still a teenage juvenile then. He pondered a moment as it came to him vividly. He remembered struggling with sleep as he observed the pill containers. He would cram all night his sophomore year for the midterms. Pizza boxes, warm grape soda, and them 5-minute cat naps in between studying, those were the days. Not that he thought of them very often. It was just one of them moments where everything surrounding him brought back that familiarity of it all. Them futile nights of restlessness were back, and much more demanding on him now, breaking him down as if sleep was nothing more than a nightmare itself. What do you think about this weather? Beautiful, isn't it? The humidity seems a bit easier to handle out here after it rains, the clerk said again, pointing towards the front end of the pharmacy. Spectacular, it truly is. I've had my eyes set on Florida since God only knows, he said, continuing to sweep against the tile where a small